I don't normally consider myself to be a very superstitious person. I haven't had a ton of eerie things happen to me. But there is one experience from my life that still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I thought you might appreciate hearing about it. When I was much younger, I had this great friend who, for the purpose of this story, let's call Sean. I met Sean so far back, I almost can't remember. And his family lived across the street, and just a house or two down. So we saw each other often. In elementary school, knowing Sean was just downright awesome, because he was the really imaginative type. He always made up the coolest games, characters, stories, and whatever other things kids would make up. We both grew up in Massachusetts, and I used to go over there all the time for sleepovers or whatever, and run around this old colonial house his parents had bought cheap and then partially fixed up. It still had tons of nooks and crannies in it that a couple of kids our age would love, though. A dumbwaiter, a crawl space, and hidden doors that actually had practical purposes, like a second cupboard, but that a kid would never think of. But when we got to middle school, things kind of changed. A lot of kids that age, myself included, were getting to the point where they were shedding childish things like Sean's games and crazy ideas that became interest in more serious topics like sports and dating. I wasn't a complete jerk, so I didn't stop talking to him or anything. But to be blunt, Sean's superpowered imagination wasn't cool anymore. I still really liked playing with him, so we still used to hang out after school though. His parents and my parents were good friends because of how long we'd known each other, and I still saw him very often. Around this same time, Sean began doing something that I noticed wasn't just a game though. He would tell me there was a man in his room that was watching him, and a lot of times he seemed genuinely upset. Like he wanted desperately for someone to take him seriously. In spite of myself, I tried to play it off, but he seemed really disturbed by it. And after bringing it up to my parents a few times, hoping that they would know what to do or how to handle the situation, they finally said that if I was so worried about Sean, they talked to his parents. Well, turns out Sean's parents knew. He had a lot of episodes where he would kick and scream and refuse to stay in his room or sleep, and they had been just as aware as I was and struggling with it. My parents, who were the ones who told me this, assured me that Sean was going to be okay, and that his parents had made sure there was no man. Sean later told me his dad stayed up all night a few times in his room, watching to make sure, despite Sean's room being on the second floor of the house. He would probably just grow out of it. My intuition told me he wasn't okay, so I pressed him about it. Sean would only talk about it in the maddening way someone talks about something that they lack the proper terms to describe. There was a man in his room that watched him was really all I got before he would clam up and get upset, at which point I would drop it. How mad his parents were getting about something they thought he was making up had a bad effect on Sean, who was now conditioning himself to avoid talking about it, because he thought it would make other people mad at him too. Once I went over to Sean's house, and he excitedly took me up to his room to show me something. He was normally reluctant to go up there, so I had pretty high hopes, until I saw what it was. Sean had grabbed pieces of paper, colored them all black with markers and crayons, and attached them to certain spots on the wall. I was stunned. His parents, on the other hand, were furious. They would both call me over and sternly explain to me that putting paper on the walls was not a game, or even just coloring the wall itself with marker, which Sean also started to do, and that I shouldn't help Sean do it because Sean knew he was upsetting them. At first, they tried to pull the papers down, but using a bunch of stuff from around the house, tape, glue, toothpaste I even remember him using, Sean started to post them up on the wall faster than his parents could take them down. As I kept on seeing him, his collage kept growing. Sean claimed that if he could cover it up enough, the man wouldn't be able to see him. I thought this was weird, since Sean always said the man was in his room. And there's no way someone could stand outside. Remember, his room was on the second floor. But I decided not to press the issue. It was one of those awkward, hot-button issues between your best friend and your parents that you never wanted to be in the middle of. Lots of times at dinner, he would get into arguments with his parents about it, and then would get so mad at him that they suddenly decided to punish him by sending me home, apologizing as I left, but explaining that Sean had to be taught a lesson until he stopped. As the months went by, I saw less and less of Sean, and at school he seemed withdrawn and distracted. One evening that I will probably never forget, my parents and I were at Sean's for dinner, and his family tried to gently break the news that Sean would be leaving for a little while. Sean later told me that he and his parents got into the biggest fight yet, and after he screamed and cried to them about the man, his parents decided that maybe Sean wasn't being a difficult child, and maybe something was really wrong. They told me that Sean was going to visit a doctor. Because they were worried that he was sick and wanted him to get better. And Sean, for his part, actually seemed delighted that he was leaving the house. We had one more get-together at their house. That was a more official going-away party with a few other kids Sean was still close to, and then he left. I wrote him letters and we still saw each other, albeit much less often. But the part that still bothers me to this day is what happened about 2 weeks after Sean was committed. Using that word to describe what happened to my friend hurts. I couldn't think of a better way to put it. But Sean was a good kid. He wasn't a crazy axe murderer. He was just a sick kid. And describing his treatment like that is just unfair and cruel for a child his age. As I said, I lived a few houses down from Sean, close enough to walk to his house. One day, the day 2 weeks after Sean had left, my family and I were having a backyard picnic when we heard Sean's mother let out a blood-curdling scream. We lived close, but for us to hear it, it still must have been pretty loud. My dad got up, told us to call the police, and immediately ran over to their house. My mom, trying to keep her panic in check, called the police, along with probably every house on the street. And after the longest 15 minutes of our lives, nervously pacing and waiting for a phone call or really anything, a few squad cars showed up. I desperately wanted to know what happened and if Sean's mom was okay. But after the police arrived, my dad came back home and would not tell me what happened. He ushered us inside and assured us both that Sean's parents were okay, but refused to discuss anything further. I was sent to bed early that night, but I crept back out and silently listened to my parents' conversation about it after. Sean's parents waited about a week before they touched his room, but with him gone, they decided it was a good opportunity to at least clean it up for him when he would eventually return. Fresh coat of paint, get some new furniture maybe, but their big project was removing the paper stuck to the wall. They tried to just rip them off by hand at first, meaning to sand it down and repaint it. But he had stuck them on so good that trying to tear them down left a mottled mess of glue, paper, and tape that was not so easy to remove. Eventually, sick of dealing with it, Sean's parents hired a contractor to come in and fix the mess for them. If you recall, Sean's family lived in an old colonial house, and because of how old and fragile it was, they actually had to remove pieces of plaster from the wall to actually get rid of all the paper. As the contractor worked, he noticed something was stuck behind the wall. And when he had removed enough to see what it was, unsure of what to do, he called Sean's parents in to see. This is when I'm assuming his mom screamed. Resting perfectly in the outline of the blacked-out papers on the wall was a skeleton. It was facing inwards toward the room the entire time it had been entombed there. It never occurred to me, when I saw him at it, what shape the dark blob was in. But by the time he left the house, it was the vague shape of an adult standing up against the wall, arms and legs together. I have no convenient explanation for you about why he was there. There was no history of violence in the house, or any town record indicating a mysterious disappearance, or anything like that. I think it ended up being so old that the police carted it off, and no charges were filed or anything. But to this day, thinking about it still sets me on edge, worse than anything else that's happened in my entire life. His family moved away after that. I stayed in contact with Sean a few years, and when we both transitioned into high school, I kind of lost him. But from that point on, Sean seemed fine, and made what the doctors considered to be a full recovery.